Welcome to this presentation on flexibility. So I've decided this was a presentation I gave in Italy back in 2019 at an exhibition called Funzioni in Azione, Functions in Action. And I've been lucky enough to teach there for the last 4 or 5 years. And so I have decided to put this on film to share with everybody that came last year and anybody else that wants to learn a little bit about flexibility and how to understand it, okay? So yeah, this is called Understanding Flexibility. Okay, my name is Marc, and I am it says international tutor, which is true. I mean, I go all over Europe and the world to teach personal trainers the benefits of many different facets of fitness in the industry. Okay, I am a lifelong martial artist, so flexibility has always been, and strength has always been at the forefront of my training. From judo as a young age in through stand-up martial arts through my teens and 20s, and find my main stand-up love is kickboxing. So I require a good level of flexibility for that performance, that function. I've also been lucky enough to do some stunt work and action performing in film and TV, and love it. Ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be like Van Damme, the physique, the flexibility. So that accelerated my learning in martial arts and luckily into the film and stunt world. Oh yeah, and I'm the guy in the first slide as well, just in case you missed it. Let's do this. So I am not just somebody that knows a theory, I actually practice what I preach and walk the walk, so to speak. So, to stretch or not to stretch? That is the question. That's kind of funny to me because where I live is quite close to Stratford-upon-Avon, and that's where Shakespeare was born. So hence the slide. It's a little in-joke that I have with myself. And this is the thing, when it comes to understand flexibility, I'm hoping to achieve through this talk to break down what flexibility is so that you can understand it a little bit more. You can understand movement and mobility, and I want you to understand, which will come apparent later on, what proprioceptors are, what sensory system do we have in the body, and how do I become a proprioceptor? That makes sense a little bit later. So what's flexibility? A lot of people think, oh, I need to be flexible, I need to do more stretching. Should I stretch? Shouldn't I stretch? I've heard that's bad. If I stretch before I train, I could get injured, and so on and so forth. So there's a little bit of a cloud of mist and confusion in what is flexibility and should I train to be flexible. Okay, flexibility itself refers to the range of motion for any given joint. Okay, the degree of flexibility that a person has is influenced by muscles and connective tissues, and stretching is a form of exercise that can lead to an increase in flexibility. That's what you get on Google if you Google flexibility. Okay, there's my reference material there. It came straight from Google. And it's like, well, what does that mean for the layperson? If I'm a client, somebody's personal training client, what does that mean for me? Even if I'm a trainer, I know that here in the UK, the base level knowledge that we get on flexibility, it's not massive. So I'm looking at this and thinking, what does that actually mean? Okay. So when you think about stretching for stretching's sake, you can see this way back as far as anyone trace to improve flexibility, the range of motion at a joint, health, and movement. Okay, there's a lot of cognitive benefits to stretching. And hormonal adaptation and response. If I'll include the reference material on this, the research papers, to say if you stretch of an evening before, statically stretch of an evening before you go to bed, it cognitively winds you down and puts you into a state of relaxation. So thus should help you sleep better. Okay, and as a form of practice, stretching was used by the Greeks and Egyptians before and after physical exercise in as early as 600 BC. In the last 50-something years, excuse me, stretching, like I said, has become a gray area and much more complex and confusing practice to the personal training initiate. My industry, what we do. Should I stretch? How long shall I hold this stretch for? Should it be static? Should it be dynamic? Should I do it before or after a workout? Why should I bother? Is it actually applicable to my sport or my activity? And these are all relative and relevant questions, and good questions. And I'm hoping to maybe just shed some light on some of that stuff now. Many people typically use static stretching in a single plane in one direction. And if you look at the classic things that you do at the end of a group exercise workout, it's a token gesture of 5 seconds of a hamstring stretch here, 5 seconds of a hamstring stretch there, of a quad stretch there. So it's very much token gesture, and it's usually uniplane, a single plane, okay, and typically the sagittal plane. Okay, you move a limb into position and you hold it for a set time. There's a lot more to it than that. So looking at that classic framework for it, single plane stretching held for the right amount of time, we need to look at two factors with this. Do I need to be flexible for general population? And what is the flexibility I need for this? And what is the flexibility I require if I am an athlete or if I'm training an athlete? Because the performance output, the end function, they're different. Okay, my mum falling under the general population category, she's not an athlete, and therefore doesn't need the same level of flexibility that an athlete would. So if we look at the general population, we need them to be flexible, or we need to train them to be flexible so that we can have them move with less pain, so that we can improve their posture, so that we can improve their range of motion, thus increasing the resilience to injury and lowering a pain threshold. Lowering pain, but thus increasing the pain threshold should they have any pain creeping in. And we need to make sure that they can successfully perform all movement patterns, which I will get to a little bit later. When we're looking at the athlete, we need all of those things from the general population because, again, they're still human and have to perform tasks that even when they're not on the track, in the dojo, in the training hall, the human being, they need to operate through daily life. So we need everything from a general population category plus an increase in performance, whatever that performance is. We need quicker recovery methods, okay? And improving flexibility will assist with this. And again, void of impact, okay, because that's really tricky to risk assess for, a decreased risk of injury, right? If you have a good range of motion at a joint, your muscles can lengthen and shorten optimally and quickly in response to a stimulus, not necessarily impact, then we should be building up resilience or lowering the risk of injury. The next question is flexibility for what? Okay, what do I need to be flexible for? What does this client need to be flexible for? So we have the two categories of general population and athlete. Where do I or where does my client fall in those two categories, and what do they or I need to be flexible for? So is it task related? Do I need to bob and weave quicker? Do I need to kick higher? Do I need to hit the ball further? Do I need to kick the ball further? Do I need to stop, turn, accelerate? Am I a core-based or field-based performance? Or do I need to just do the splits because it looks cool on camera and because it's a lifelong goal that I've always wanted to do? So it becomes a question of what is the need for me to be flexible, okay? What is my function? I am absolutely talking about functional training and functional performance. So my whole ethos in terms of training and program design and prescription is about functions. Find out what the function is, train for that function. And we're going to talk a little bit about that now. So it's functional flexibility. What do I specifically need to be functionally flexible for? No function, no performance. Or no function, no performance. Okay, cited by Gary Gray in 2006. And I will put all of these research names and where to find the links for these people that have influenced me in some links at the end of this talk. And because the thing, I didn't make this stuff up. I am standing on the shoulders of giants here and giving good messages and breaking it down and talking about it like I need it understood for me. So whenever I teach anything, if I'm lucky enough to be in the room with you and teach you, I try to teach like I would need to be taught. Okay, so there's analogies and it kind of makes sense, and I'm a little bit animated at times. Anyway, so we're talking about know the function, and then you can apply the performance to it. And this comes to functional training. And that's again, like stretching and flexibility is a little bit confusing for the PT initiate rather. So is functional training. Well, that's a really functional training gym, and that trainer is really functional. I'm a more functional trainer than that trainer. What does that mean for real? Okay, and I have different topics and different talks on functional training. But for the purpose of this right now, we can talk about functional training and or training for function, because there is a difference. Okay, it is general and there's specific, and I think that you should be able to work out which one is which. Okay, when we're talking about functional training, we're talking about training movement patterns. Okay, movement patterns coined by Paul Chek and later adapted. Okay, but we're talking about train all movement patterns through a full range of motion across all three planes of motion. As a generalization, as a general rule for most human beings, okay, we look at squatting and lunging and lifting or hinging. Okay, there's push patterns, there's pull patterns, there's twisting or rotation patterns. There's smashing or throwing, there's gait and locomotion and carrying things, okay? And there's also fighting. And these movement patterns encompass what a human being is capable of in terms of the framework and the movements that we can do. Okay, we get up out of a chair and we are performing a squat pattern. We pick something up off the floor and it's a hinge or a lift pattern. We push things, we pull things. Fighting is a primal pattern that we've done as humans, but we used to fight for survival. Thankfully, we don't have to do that anymore. So now we just fight for fun, for sport. Or in Starbucks at the queue because you want to. No, I'm joking. So when we look at this, this is a general rule for training, functional training for human beings. Train all of these movement patterns through a full range of motion across all three planes, and then you should be able to adapt to many different performance-based activities and build a resilience to injury. When we're talking about training for a specific function, okay, that's where we're talking about now. We need to understand the movement for that performance-based activity, and then we need to understand what flexibility is and how to apply it to that. Okay, so we still train the movement patterns as a human being, but then some of them are more dominant than others when it comes to training for a specific task. So understand movement to understand flexibility. I said that just now for this. So when we're talking about movement, and I briefly touched on it then about planes, okay, we need to make sure that we can move successfully through all three planes through a full range of motion at all of the joints in the body to understand flexibility. So to apply flexibility to it and to assess whether I am tight in the hip here or tight in the ankle or the thoracic spine here or there. So we're talking about three planes of motion, and to just recap on this, they are the sagittal plane, the frontal plane, and the transverse plane. And when I teach this, I always list them in order of dominance. We're super strong and stable in the sagittal plane, forwards and backwards, straight up and down. Anything that takes us through the frontal plane into AB or adduction, adduction or abduction, we're less strong than the sagittal plane, which is flexion extension. And then the transverse plane is weaker again, it's less dominant again in terms of that hierarchy. So anything that involves rotation, we're historically weaker at than the other two planes. But when it comes to flexibility and range of motion around these joints, and you can see the little image there, it's the hip joint. It's going through flexion and it's going through extension, it's going through abduction and adduction, or adduction, it's going through internal rotation, it's going through external rotation. And this, for this demonstration, is done on my right hip. Okay, all the joints in the body go through those six motions: flexion, extension, so in all three planes, except AB adduction, internal and external rotation. Sometimes medial lateral rotation, depending on the practitioner that's talking. Okay, so again, when you understand this, you're looking for symmetry. Does my left hip move through flexion and extension equally as my right, or is it a bit sticky on one side or the other? So you're trying to understand feedback from your own body in terms of what it likes and what it dislikes. Is it tight in this direction or that direction? So when you understand the when you understand the movements in the different directions, and you think, well, across my hip joint, going through the sagittal plane, flexion and extension, what muscles cross the hip joint, anterior and posterior? Which muscles facilitate or create the movement that I need to bring my hip into flexion and extension? So now I'm saying, let's talk to the muscles. Let's tell the muscles what we want them to do. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. And when I'm in the room, I'm always asking for feedback. So does that make sense? So right now on video is slightly different, but I want you to get in, to be mindful of the muscles and think about the muscle and say, hey, look, I want you to go through flexion. What muscles are going to contract, okay, and what muscles are going to lengthen? So which ones are going to concentrically contract and eccentrically contract if I'm bringing my hip joint into a flexed position. So it's, and again, I'm not going to go through every joint in the body on this. That's up to you as professionals to understand your A&P, which I'm assuming that you do. When we're talking to the muscles, they are either a pump or they are a spring. If they're a pump, you're classically shortening it. Okay, so if we're thinking the biceps on this, right? No, let's take the glutes. We've been talking about the hip. If I'm thinking of my glutes as a pump, they contract and shorten, shorten, shorten. Okay, like you're compressing air out of a pump. Okay. If I think about my glutes as a spring, like a coil spring, it's in its equilibrium right now, but when I bring it into my glutes into an extended position, so I'm stretching them, boom, they have to fire back to normal. Load, boom, unload, load, unload. I'm stretching my glutes, I'm pulling my glute back to a neutral position or a relaxed state. Still talking about the glute, but I'm not talking about it shortening, I'm talking about it lengthening. So it's the same muscle, and that's kind of that blew my mind back just over 12 years ago, a decade ago, because I'm like, everything I thought about muscle movement, it's backwards, or it has the potential to be backwards with the right application. So the glute doesn't necessarily extend the hip. As a spring, it decelerates extension of the hip. So if I'm thinking about the glutes as a spring, the glute doesn't actually extend the hip, okay, like a pump would. The function of the glutes in terms of flexibility, as a spring, I'm thinking about the glutes as decelerating flexion of the hip. So rather than extending the hip as its primary function, if I load it and I'm stretching it, the function is to decelerate hip flexion. And that took me a while to get my head around when you start looking at the pecs and the delts and hip flexors, etc. It's like that took everything that I thought I knew and flipped it up on its head. So phase one for me, before any performance-related task, is to load the springs, is to think about the muscle and the joint it crosses and think, how do I load that spring in all three planes? So looking at the example I have here, if I'm looking for effective amortization, the transformation point or transformation zone between concentric and eccentric, or rather eccentric and concentric contractions, I do something like this. Now, this is a posterior lunge with an overhead reach. And as you see, as I am lunging backwards and throwing my hands over my head, my hip and my torso, my anterior chain torso, come into an extended state. So I'm looking for a maximum distance lunge as my hands go up over my head to give me effective hip extension. Okay, I'm lengthening. So if I'm doing a live example in the room right here, I'm doing a posterior lunge with an overhead reach that gives me a solution to a tight hip flexor here, and I'm lengthening my left hip flexor. Okay, which if you think about volleying a football, right, the football's on the floor and I step into position and I load up here, boom. At this position, if I freeze frame here, and you can see that this left hip is in an extended state. Well, if I don't train extending this hip to shorten, so load and unload, load the spring, deload the spring, okay, the reaction that I need to kick that ball when that ball comes into play is going to be a lot slower than it would be to a trained individual. And when I say loading the springs, okay, and talking to the muscles, I'm thinking about these chaps. The people on this, these are the proprioceptors, our flexible friends, right? And these are the sensors in the muscles. And I think that more attention needs to be paid to the proprioceptive system to understand greater flexibility and performance. Hence why it's in here. Okay, so these will give you optimal eccentric loading if you understand their roles. Okay, and I've thrown 6 of these guys up here. If you can stimulate certain proprioceptors and you understand the roles that they perform and the critical points that they perform it and how to stimulate these proprioceptors, you're into a greater understanding of flexibility right off the bat, okay? So the ones that I've chosen here, the ones that we're going to talk about, and there are a lot more than this, but this is where I would start if I want to understand a little bit more on range of motion, mobility, flexibility. And I treat these like detectives, because some detect a change in length, some detect a change in stimulus, in pressure, in direction, in speed, and velocity. But they're all part of a team that work together to improve your eccentric to concentric loading, okay? Here in the UK, when we do a basic personal training qualification, we're told of pretty much two, the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organs. And it depends on the tutor that you receive on that course to how much they actually know, as in understand, or how much they know because they've read something and they're just relaying that information. Either way, it's good information, it's just not enough. Personally, I feel it's not enough, as is the planes of motion in the different directions. That's not taught in enough depth for me. So when we look at these, I've got the muscle spindles in here, which we'll get to later. I've got Golgi tendon organs in here, but there are a whole bunch of others as well, like Posterior corpuscles, like Ruffini endings, Golgimezone, and for me, they're like, I think I probably watched too many movies like the Godfather or Sopranos or something, because these team of detectives and they've all got Italian names and it's really cool. So sometimes I talk a little bit like I'm trying to be Marlon Brando. You know, bad example, maybe. But this is where it's at in my head, and this analogy works for me because this little team of detectives work together like they're cousins, like they're brothers, like they're a team of people to help. So when we look at each of these, right, we'll look at Posterior corpuscles detect a change in pressure. Golgimezone detects a change in range of motion. The Ruffini endings detect joint position and velocity, and I'm going to break this down a little bit more in a second. The Golgi ligament endings, okay, connective tissue force. They detect connective tissue force or force in connective tissues. Golgi tendon organs detect a change in muscle force or detect muscle force, and you can see now how they're starting to work together as a team for movement-based activities. And then the muscle spindles are the I'm not going to say the last people in the chain of command, but these are the ones that take action. Okay, and these detect a change and can affect muscle length and the speed in which the muscle lengthens and shortens. So when we look at Posterior corpuscles, these guys detect a change in pressure. So they're typically in the distal joints, okay? So think about your hands and your feet. They're in all the joints, okay? But they respond really well to high velocity changes in different directions. So they're very good to accelerate and decelerate and communicate really well and really quick. So for example, if you're on a block and you jump down onto the floor, your mid-tarsal joints get switched on really quickly, and then they send a really quick WhatsApp signal, okay, right upstairs to the spinal cord, into the central nervous system to, hey, something's going on. And then they'll communicate with the others to do their jobs, okay? And it's like they're really jittery, like they've had too many espressos, and they're always ready for action, and they're twitchy. And that's why if you think about the joints of the foot and how freely they all should move, and every muscle that crosses those tiny little joints has these proprioceptors in them, okay, a lot of things like skipping and multi-directional change in work over hurdles and things like this should be in any performance-based sport that require you to stop, turn, accelerate, and change direction really quickly. Golgimezone corpuscles, these detect change in range of motion. So they activate specifically when the joint gets to closer to end range, okay? And if these guys get switched on, okay, they'll alert all the rest of the team, all of the cousins and brothers, all the other proprioceptors, hey, you heads up guys, something is coming, okay? So you better get yourself ready. Like this, I'm talking using words, but this happens at such a massive, such a high speed that you don't, obviously as subconscious, you don't think about it. They just have a really good communication network between them. The Ruffini endings, these detect a joint position and velocity. Okay, so they're in the proximal joint capsules, so proximal being closer to the midline of the body. So here, if you just think the hips and the trunk, okay, that's a good place to start, the joints of the hips and the trunk. Okay, they emit a resting discharge, so for non-weight bearing activities, and an active discharge for weight bearing activities. So again, they're always ready to go. These guys switch on a little in the sagittal and the frontal plane, but if you really want to get them going, you really want to stimulate the Ruffini endings, take them through the transverse plane. I love the transverse plane. I think it's highly neglected. I think everybody should rotate better than they do. Everybody, general sweeping statement, but most people should rotate better than they do. And they're like, look, I'm not as quick as some of the other guys to be alerted, but do you know what? If I have to act, we'll all act at the same time, okay? Because I'm up here and I'm not down the end, down the bottom like the Posterior corpuscles in the distal joints like the feet and the hands. But you know what? By the time their communication gets up to the central nervous system, bang, mine's there as well, goes straight up to the brain, and then we act on it. Okay, so again, as a communication network, these guys work hand in hand together. The Golgi ligament endings, okay? Ligament endings, have a guess where they're situated. Okay, these detect a change in connective tissue force. All right, they are intrinsic and extrinsic ligament endings. So if you just think the cruciate and collateral ligaments of the knee, if these guys get a full mechanical stimulus, so what that means is if you turn them on a little, they get turned on a lot. And you have to think that they're not as ligaments are not as elastic as tendons, right? So there's less room for them to go. These guys are sensitive to touch and stretch on the ligament, and what you need them to do is you need to be able to train them in different directions to understand a threshold. So if we're taking the knee, for instance, and we're classically taught that the knee is a hinge joint, so it just goes through flexion and extension. But if I'm performing a tasks like kickboxing and I'm up in this position and my hips drive first and my knee comes into an adducted state before it extends, okay? If my knee is never really been trained to rotate at the joint, and this could be things like through curtsy lunges in the transverse plane, my threshold for lateral movement, okay, so frontal plane movement or transverse plane movement in my knee is a lot less if I've not trained that stuff. Okay, so if I've only done leg extension, hamstring curls, sagittal plane movements from my knee, but my performance out there requires me to twist. Okay, so if we take a hook punch, right, boom, and I have to twist my knee in. Okay, if my foot's flat on the floor, this is the threshold of my knee as it goes into an adducted state. So it's adducted this side and abducted this side. It's a pretty decent range of motion at the knee because I've trained it to do that. But if it's just gone through the sagittal plane flexion and extension and I try it, pop goes my ligaments. Okay, so I'm relying on the training that I've done to train these guys, okay, the GLEs, to say, hey, that's a decent threshold there, but they're saying, hey, boy, don't go beyond that, otherwise I'm going to tear. And it's that feedback that you're listening to. It's the sensors telling you, don't go any further, that you're trying to understand. The GTOs, the Golgi tendon organs. So these are, for me, these are like the gatekeepers, the bouncers on the door of the nightclub. Okay, they stand at the junction where the muscle becomes a tendon, okay, and attaches to the bone. They feel and monitor contractions both eccentrically and concentrically. Okay, and depending on the speed that this occurs, will give you a different outcome. Okay, we'll give them a different task we'll give the muscle a different task to perform. If it's slow and you hold it like a static stretch, all right, that's for a non-functional stimulus. And this is where the whole should I stretch before or after exercise comes into play. They can switch on the whole proprioceptive system or they can switch off the whole proprioceptor system. And if they switch off the whole proprioceptor system, whew, the muscle relaxes. That's bad. You don't want the muscle to relax if you're then going to go out and do power kicks onto a pad. Or do some sort of plyometric work, okay? If you've switched off the proprioceptors or you've told the proprioceptor system to just dampen down and just quieten down, because I'm looking to get a longer, more relaxed, flexed feeling, flexible feeling out of my muscles, it's bad if you need them to actively do something for you. If you do it fast, okay, if you load them and then take them off and load them and take them off. So when I'm in the room with people, I talk about, if I have cable, like a light cable and I can see the copper wire inside. If I lengthen this cable really quick, I want you to imagine that the copper wire in this electrical cable gets a spark. Spark, spark, fire, 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 lengthen, 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 fire, stimulus, on, on. Then the GTO is like, okay, I've just switched on the muscle and I've told the rest of the proprioceptor system that some sort of activity is coming. So let's get ready for this. Do you know what I mean? Switch yourselves on, let's go. And then they're ready for action. I hope that makes sense. But it's still the GTOs of these are the boys and girls that say, let's rest or let's go. So if you can think about static stretch, and if you can think about lengthening a muscle and holding it in place, and then it just switches off and gives you a nice relaxed floppy feeling, do that afterwards. Don't do that before activity, do it afterwards. So, but if you lengthen, fire, fire, stimulate, spark, 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 that's dynamic stretching, not ballistic, but dynamic. And that makes dynamic activity after you've done this safe and effective. So then we have the muscle spindles. And the muscle spindles detect a change in length and can create a change in length. These are the conductors of the whole proprioceptor orchestra. Right, typically found in the belly of the muscle. They detect a change in length and the speed at which it lengthens. Then they contract to protect. Okay, that's that. If you think of these detectives as they're trying to protect the joint, that's their job. When they get stimulated, they have a choice. They either relax or contract. And if you've ever tried to stretch beyond a certain point, you know that tension feeling. You know when it's, oh, yo, don't go any further, that's painful. That's the muscle spindles then holding on to say, I'm not sure that if we're doing a hamstring stretch, I'm not sure that you're not going to break the knee when you do this. And they have their own instant message, and their own WhatsApp, their own iMessenger, whatever, that can bypass the central nervous system and go straight to the active contraction of the muscle. Because if they didn't do that, if they had to wait for the central nervous system up to the spine, up the M1, talk to the brain, back down the M1, out to the relevant limbs and the muscles to contract, it may be too late at that point, and snap goes a muscle, or rip goes a muscle. So let's think about the classic hamstring one. So if I am the hamstring, okay, and we're thinking about a client laying on the floor, you're bracing them and you're pushing their limb into position. At some point then, the hamstrings lock up. And when the hamstring locks up, the muscle spindles are pulling on it to say, protect the joint, protect the joint, protect the joint. Now, what we're saying is how, let's say the aim of this is to improve flexibility and improve the hamstring stretch, okay? At this position, if we hold it for 2 seconds and bring it off, and 2 seconds and bring it off, we're not telling the muscle, we're not giving the muscle spindles a new range of motion to be okay with. If we hold the hamstring in position, and say we're holding this for give or take 30 seconds, what happens is then the muscle spindle, after about let's say 20 seconds, and I'm a bit hesitant to say a specific figure because it depends on person to person. Some people it takes 16 seconds, some people it may take 24 seconds. So if we hold this in position for a set amount of time, at some point the muscles, the hamstrings are going to say, okay, we're not going to break. We're not, the knee is pretty safe, okay? So then we're going to shout back down to the whole proprioceptor system. We're going to say, hey, look, I'm semi-mem, semi-10, and bicep femoris, we're okay. Us three here, we've got this now. The knee is safe. So proprioceptors, you can stand down for a second, okay? So you can relax. And at that point, the muscles have fed back to the proprioceptors to stand down. That's when the pain goes away or dissipates slightly, and you get a little bit more range out of that movement, okay? My kickboxing coach back in the day used to say, it's the secondary stretch. Feel the secondary stretch. I mean, I don't actually think he knew exactly the science behind this, but now I do. So I'm trying to relay what he was talking about back then. It's when you stretch to a point of bind and you stay there long enough for that point of bind to relax. Well, that's the proprioceptors letting you have the muscles back. So then you can improve that range and go through that process again and again and again, hence developmental stretching, developmental flexibility. And you need to think about that for every, possibly not every joint, but every potential tight joint, okay? So you think about the hip flexors, the hamstring, the glutes. they're either dysfunctional or tight in a lot of people. The pecs are usually tight because of, tablet syndrome or phone syndrome and computer syndrome. So these being stretched, you may need to understand the proprioceptors of the pecs in this case, from origin to insertion, and how quickly you perform the stretch or how long you hold it for. So let's look at solutions, okay? And again, it becomes solution to what? So the examples that we threw up earlier on in this presentation, okay? Let's think about some of the solutions to performance-based things that require us to stop, turn, and accelerate really quickly. The proprioceptors that we have involved in this, Posterior corpuscles, Golgimezone, Golgi ligament endings, and the GTOs. So we need to think about, let's do multidirectional work at different speeds. Okay, let's do plyometric work in all three planes. Do I jump sagittal? Do I jump sideways? And can I jump and twist at the same time so that my knees will get used to, that's also how I dance, functional dancing, okay? My knees will get used to moving in all three planes. So dynamic stretching in all three planes. So we can move the hamstrings and the hip flex through the sagittal plane, and then we can move the hips through the frontal plane and through the transverse plane and frontal plane at the same time with practical application. And then we need to establish what end ranges. What is my threshold for the knee at end range? What is my threshold for the hip at end range? Is it symmetrical left and right? Do I need it to be symmetrical left and right? For me as a martial artist, absolutely. Okay, you should flex. You should have equal amount of flexibility on your left side as you should your right side. Even so, if I'm an orthodox fighter, I should also be a southpaw fighter. I should have balance. Okay, obviously when I'm in the ring, I'm going to compete at my more dominant, stronger side because I need the win. Okay, but just in training, orthodox left side and right side should be 90 to 95% as good as each other. Let's look at kickboxing and boxing. Okay, so we need Ruffini endings, we need Posterior corpuscles, we need the multidirectional work, we need Golgimezone to be relevant and here and awake and ready. We need the GTOs and the GLEs. They all need to be active for us to perform our tasks. Multidirectional work, again, at different varied velocities and speeds. Plyometric work in all three planes. Whether you're performing like in boxing, right? You don't necessarily need to jump to hit somebody, but the bones and joints need to be able to react eccentric and concentrically quick enough to avoid injury. Dynamic stretching in all three planes. Establishing an end range, again. What is end range for the hip, the knee, the shoulder, and proximal versus distal end range dynamic stretching. What do I mean by this? Is like I need to be able to kick a certain height, ideally from cold, okay? Me pushing 40 years of age now, I still want to make sure I've got a decent level of flexibility to be able to throw a kick nice and high from cold. By my whole proprioceptive system for the last 25, 30 years of doing this, staying strong and always being present when I move. You may not need to do a high side split looking kick in boxing because you're not allowed to kick, but in kickboxing you would. So it's relevant to have that sequencing and that end range for dynamic and kind of static activities. Well, let's look at the splits, all right? Only because it was on the front cover of this and it's kind of cool to be able to do. Okay, we're talking predominantly the muscle spindles here, all right? Static stretching, and I choose this example because it's quite a drastic end range static stretch to be able to perform for the lower body. Okay, so making static stretching becoming active, things like PNF stretching, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, and that's tricking the muscles into thinking they're longer than they are. Okay, I just wanted to jump in with a separate video because when I was watching the talk that I did on stretching on playback, I felt I didn't cover PNF. I didn't cover PNF as much as I would have liked to. So I'm just gonna shoehorn this little clip into the main video. So the continuity's out. I'm in a different t-shirt and the angle's different and all that sort of stuff. But just forgive me, guys. I just want to elaborate a little bit more on PNF. Now, I just said that PNF tricks the muscle into thinking it's longer than it is. And essentially what's happened with PNF, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, okay, you're getting the brains, the nerves, and the muscles all involved at the same time to try and work together to make a muscle longer than it was before you started. And what happens is, you bring a muscle to a point of bind. So I'm going to use the example I've used throughout this talk anyway, about the hamstring. So I'm a trainer and I am pushing somebody's hamstring into a stretch position. They're supine on the floor, their hip is flexed, and I'm moving their hamstring to an extended state and says, hey, what are you doing, right? That the brain knows at this point the muscle is being stretched, and that the proprioceptors, the origin and insertion, are hanging onto it for dear life because they think that you're going to snap the knee. So when you stay in this position, like I've already talked about muscle spindles, etc., and everything is going to start damping down and quieting down. But if you contract that muscle that's being stretched, the brain thinks, hang on, there's no way this muscle can be stretched or weak if it's contracting. So for a muscle to contract, the opposing muscle has to relax, as we know, okay, agonist, antagonist, etc. So when this stretch muscle, this agonist muscle is started to contract, the brain thinks, it's not, how could it be at risk if it's contracting? It's in control. And you're consciously doing this. Your mind is telling the muscle to contract. Not autonomically, you are controlling this contraction. I like to do a ratio of a 30-second hold to a 15-second contraction, which is outside of the norm, and I'll post the PNF, the general PNF rules into the PDF or some link on the website that accompanies this video. Anyway, so I have stretched the muscle. The muscle is now contracting. The brain is thinking, well, it can't be at risk. The joint can't be at risk if the muscle is contracting over that joint. So what happens is then in this almost 90% of extension of the muscle, the second it slacks off, it allows you to go a little bit further before the tension comes back on and it thinks, oh, I'm at risk again. So if you follow this cycle of stretch and contract, further stretch and contract, further stretch and contract, it is a surefire, speedy way, safe way to get somebody into a greater flexibility. And when it comes to PNF, do you need to PNF every muscle? Absolutely not, okay? If I can extend my arm to the side, okay, I do not have to PNF my bicep. All right, think about the muscles that should get PNF to extend flexibility. Chances are it's going to be hip flexors, it's going to be hamstrings, it's probably going to be pecs, okay, because you need to think of the muscles that are typically tight in most human beings, in most clients. So to improve that flexibility with a PNF stretch for that individual muscle and or muscle group, it has huge benefits into pain reduction and improving flexibility for performance, again, post-workout or on its own. There's a lot of confusion when it comes to stretching and static stretching in general, but specifically PNF, where people think stretch after a workout and it's going to reduce my delayed onset of muscle soreness, my DOMS in the following day. Now, if you undertake something like PNF stretching, the fact that you're contracting a muscle in a lengthened state will give you DOMS. Okay, so don't be fooled into thinking that PNF stretching, yes, it will improve flexibility, but don't think it's going to reduce DOMS, because stretching through PNF stretching or improving flexibility with PNF stretching will more than likely give you delayed onset of muscle soreness. So just bear that in mind when you're doing this, okay? And there's other factors to take into consideration with PNF stretching, and they will also be posted in the notes to accompany this video. But utilizing PNF and taking a static stretch and moving the limbs in all three planes, it's a great way statically to improve the range of motion and the flexibility, pliability of that muscle. Static stretching in all three planes, and again, assess the threshold for the secondary stretch. Okay, yes, I use that term too. So if you imagine in a side split position, okay, and you tilt forwards into it with your legs straight, at some point your adductor group and your hamstring are going to say, what are you doing? That's painful. And then you just stay there and get a timer out and say, well, okay, it's taken 19 seconds for that pain to dissipate before I push into it again. Then it takes a further 12 seconds before it dissipates a second time. So, which is fine. And that will vary from person to person, but establish what your threshold is, what your client's threshold is, so that you can bring that into every protocol you stretch, and you can think about programming for it as well. So in summary, find your function, find your flexibility for that function. Stretching should be sequential, all right? Both rapid and static. Rapid first, static after. A 30-minute stretching session should be half of it dynamic and mobilization based. The second half should be static if you're trying to improve flexibility. Move quickly and slowly in all three planes. and stimulate the whole proprioceptive system. Get the senses involved, be friends with them, put their t-shirts on and understand the roles that they perform. And then when the next time you're holding a static hamstring hip flexor stretch, think about that point where the pain kicks in and you're like, oh, okay, that's just the muscle spindles. They've had a conversation together. They've locked up now because they're afraid you're gonna hurt the hip. And then when you stay there, you can say, hey, do you know what, system? You can relax a bit now and give me my muscles back. I'm in control of what's going on. You don't have to worry. If you want to know a little bit more, all right, give me a shout. I am open to have a conversation with anybody that wants to learn, or anybody wants to pick my brains on this, or even challenge some of the stuff I said, because I am always learning with this, but I've tried to put this into a format that it makes sense to me, and hopefully it kind of makes sense to you too. But here are all my handles, Instagram and Twitter and all that sort of stuff. There's my email address on there as well. If you want to fire me an email, I will reply. And some of the companies that I teach for and I do this work for. So please reach out and get in touch.